Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkably stories of people who walked among knights, priests and peasants, and made Don't Go Out After Dark a permanent part of medieval times. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the charming town of Chalons, sometime in the 15th or 16th century, lived a man who was both a respected tailor and, allegedly, a part-time cannibal. Because who says you can't have hobbies? Known today only as the Tailor of Chalons, this fine gentleman allegedly lured children into his shop under the guise of giving them cookies, fitting them for clothes, or offering them work. You know, classic medieval job scams. Once inside, he would murder them, butcher their bodies and here's the part where France really shines, turn them into meat pies. Yes, human meat pies. Move over, Sweeney Todd. The French may have gotten there first. It's said that he enjoyed these pies personally, but also served them to unwitting guests. So, if you ever wondered what the Middle Ages did before TripAdvisor reviews, well, this is how things went sideways. His culinary preferences went undiscovered until one particularly bold child managed to escape and sound the alarm. The townspeople, either horrified or just really tired of mystery meat, stormed his premises. What they found inside was not a humble tailor's shop. No, this was an artisanal murder boutique. Blood-stained tools, bones, preserved flesh, and enough evidence to make even the local priest throw up on the spot. He was arrested naturally, and his trial was one for the ages. When asked to defend himself, he simply admitted it. No lengthy denial. No witches made me do it. Just a very medieval shrug. His sentence? Burned alive at the stake, as all good nightmares ended back then. Some historians argue the entire thing was a moral panic, possibly even propaganda meant to vilify minorities or heretics. But whether fact, fiction, or an exaggerated cautionary tale, the Tailor of Chalons remains a symbol of how terrifyingly thin the line between respected tradesman and unsupervised serial killer could be in the Middle Ages. Moral of the story? Always ask what's in the pie, and maybe don't trust a tailor who insists on doing fittings in the basement. If medieval France were a soap opera, Gilles de Rais would have been the wealthy noble who seemed charming at the feast, but definitely had a dungeon full of problems. Literally. Before his reputation got darker than a plague-ridden alley, Gilles de Rais was a national hero, a brave knight, a companion in arms to none other than Joan of Arc. Yes, that Joan. He rode into battle under her banner, fought the English, and made everyone's grandmother proud. For a time, he was basically medieval France's golden boy, except with slightly more body armour and slightly fewer TikToks. Then Joan was burned at the stake, and Gilles went off script. After retiring from military life, and by retiring, we mean no longer legally stabbing people on behalf of the king, Gilles turned to theatre. He built stages, cast elaborate productions, and spent vast fortunes on costumes, props, and actors. Which sounds charming, until you realise he was funding his hobbies by pawning family heirlooms and eventually mortgaging everything he owned, including, potentially, his sanity. But the real nightmare wasn't his spending habits. It was what was happening behind the curtain. Whispers began to circulate. Servants went missing. Travellers vanished near his estates. Alchemists visited. Black magic rituals were rumoured. Eventually, the church, not known for its chill, took notice. What they found at his castle shocked even the most hardened inquisitors. Hidden rooms, grim implements, and, let's just say, forensic science in the 1400s consisted mostly of people vomiting and shouting, "Demon." When arrested, Gilles confessed in horrifying detail. Whether out of guilt, madness, or just medieval peer pressure, he didn't hold back. Torture helped move things along, as it usually did. But there was enough physical evidence to remove all doubt. He wasn't just a killer, he had made it an ongoing enterprise. In 1440, Gilles de Rais was sentenced to death. He was allowed to confess publicly and die with a degree of repentance, which, for a man accused of atrocities that made his fellow knights queasy, was more mercy than many thought he deserved. So how does one go from holy war hero to one of the most reviled criminals in French history? Easy. Take a sharp turn after the battlefield, add a bit of unchecked wealth, sprinkle in an alchemist, and absolutely no therapy. If there was ever a medieval woman who would have absolutely dominated Instagram's self-care niche, it was Elizabeth Bathory. Noblewoman, heiress, and alleged human exfoliator. Born in 1560 to one of Hungary's most powerful families, Elizabeth had everything: land, titles, castles, and allegedly a rather disturbing nighttime routine. Forget face masks and essential oils. According to legend, she believed the secret to eternal youth was bathing in the blood of young village girls. You know, just like Gwyneth Paltrow, if Gwyneth took things way too literally. Of course, the truth, like most things in medieval history, is murky, full of political intrigue, missing records, and people with very suspicious motivations. Elizabeth was highly educated for a woman of her time. She spoke 4 languages, managed estates, and even defended her lands while her husband was off being a war hero. After he died, she ran the show alone, which in 17th century Hungary meant every male relative suddenly decided she was too powerful to be left unslandered. And so the rumours began. Peasants started disappearing. Servants were sent to her castle and never returned. Witnesses claimed they saw corpses, mysterious bruises, bite marks, even signs of ritual torture. One servant claimed Elizabeth had a custom iron cage suspended from the ceiling, a sort of medieval piñata that screamed instead of giving out candy. Eventually, King Matthias of Hungary had enough. He sent investigators, and by investigators, we mean a team of men who really didn't like the idea of a woman owning multiple castles. Elizabeth was arrested in 1610, not tried. That would be messy. Instead, her accomplices were tortured and executed, while she was quietly bricked into a room in her own castle. Literally. Just a hole in the wall for food, home arrest, medieval edition. Modern historians argue that she may have been the victim of a frame job. The accusations conveniently allowed powerful men to seize her lands. After all, who needs legal precedent when you can just yell witchcraft and call it a day? Still, guilty or not, the Blood Countess became legend. A mix of true crime, folklore, and horrifying skincare myths that somehow persist to this day. Moral of the story: if your beauty routine involves any kind of blood, you've probably gone too far. Even for the Renaissance. Germany in the late 1500s was not exactly a place known for its calm rationality. Plagues, religious wars, and the occasional demonic goat made everyday life feel like a fever dream wrapped in a nightmare. Which is probably why the townsfolk of Bedburg weren't too surprised when someone decided to blame a series of brutal murders on a literal werewolf. Enter Peter Stump. Stump, also spelled stump, stubber, or absolutely not someone you'd want near your livestock, was a wealthy farmer living near Cologne. By day, he seemed respectable, owned land, had kids, paid taxes, probably waved politely at neighbours. By night? Well, that's where things get hairy. Local reports claimed that people were disappearing at an alarming rate, their bodies found mauled, dismembered, or just not found at all, livestock too. Something, or someone, was tearing through the countryside with the appetite of a medieval Uber Eats demon. Suspicion spread. Eventually, the townspeople captured Stump after what was described as a werewolf hunt, which is a phrase you don't hear much outside of bad fantasy novels and even worse legal trials, under torture. And when we say torture, we mean the kind of enthusiastic bone-snapping popular with inquisitors. Stump confessed to a lot, not just murder. He claimed to have made a pact with the devil, who gave him a magical belt that turned him into a wolf. Very eco-friendly. No full moon required. He also admitted to devouring his victims, practicing dark arts, and just for extra medieval spice, to being romantically involved with his own daughter. because apparently you couldn't be accused of supernatural murder without adding a bit of awkward family drama. Stump was executed in 1589, and the sentence was one of the more creative ones. First, he was strapped to a wheel and had his flesh torn with red-hot pincers. Then, his limbs were broken with the blunt end of an axe. Finally, his head was cut off, his body burned, and his daughter was also executed, just in case you were worried things might end gently. To this day, historians debate whether Peter Stump was truly a monster, mentally unwell, or simply the unlucky scapegoat for a panicked, deeply superstitious society. Either way, if someone ever offers you a magical werewolf belt, maybe just stick to regular pants. Some families pass down heirlooms, others pass down recipes. The Bean family. They allegedly passed down a generational fondness for eating people. Welcome to the legend of Alexander Sawney Bean, a man who, according to 16th century Scottish folklore, decided that living in a coastal cave with his wife and eventually 40-plus offspring was just the right balance of privacy, savings, and casual cannibalism. Now, historians still debate whether Sawney ever existed. His story doesn't show up in records until centuries later, and much of it feels like a fever dream made up after too many mugs of questionable ale. But let's not let historical accuracy get in the way of a perfectly good bedtime horror story. According to legend, Sawney Bean and his wife moved into a cave on the Scottish coast near Ayrshire. The cave was deep, dark, and inaccessible during high tide, basically the medieval version of a gated community, if your idea of comfort includes dripping seawater and echoing screams. There, they raised a very large, very interconnected family. And by interconnected, we mean the Bean family tree resembled more of a circle. Incest was apparently the only thing more abundant than the body count. How did they eat? Well, they didn't farm, or fish, or trade. Instead, they ambushed travellers on nearby roads, dragged them back to their lair, dismembered them, salted the remains for later, and tossed the bones into sea cave piles. If this is starting to sound like a particularly grim episode of MasterChef, you're not alone. Over the years, hundreds of people vanished along that stretch of road. Locals suspected witches, monsters, or English tax collectors. No one thought to look inside a dank coastal cavern populated by a murderous, meat-eating commune with all the charm of a haunted sausage factory. Eventually, the king himself, usually too busy invading England or ignoring famines, got involved. A search party finally discovered the Beans' cave, along with evidence of their horrific hobby. Body parts hanging like medieval charcuterie, barrels of salted limbs, and generations of people who had never seen the sun or a vegetable. The entire clan was arrested and executed without trial. Most were burned alive. The others were hacked apart. Apparently, even 16th century justice had its limits, and patience. Real or not, the Sawney Bean story serves as a reminder. If a creepy family invites you to dinner, check what's on the menu. Now, not every medieval serial killer wore a crown or wielded an axe. Some just showed up in the night sky with a pack of spectral dogs, making noises like a haunted brass band. Enter Heliquin's Hounds, a demonic hunting party from medieval European folklore, best described as Scooby-Doo meets the Purge, minus the talking dog, and with a lot more screaming. In various corners of Europe, especially France, Germany, and England, people whispered of a ghostly cavalcade that tore through the night sky or woods. A host of hunters led by a shadowy figure named Heliquin, or Hurler, or Woden, depending on your zip code and local myth budget. These weren't your average ghost stories. They were warnings. Don't be out after dark, or you'll get snatched by the wild hunt and dragged into the afterlife, possibly while still alive. Very motivational. But here's where it gets suspiciously serial killery. In the 11th and 12th centuries, chroniclers started describing real deaths linked to sightings of this hunt. Bodies were found mangled, crushed, or simply vanished, usually near forests or lonely roads. Some towns even had no travel after sunset ordinances, based on the belief that the hunt was not just supernatural, but selective. It wasn't just haunting, It was harvesting. Now, were there actually spectral horsemen snatching souls into the void? Probably not. But were there people using the myth as cover to commit actual murders? Almost certainly. Think about it. You live in a superstitious village. It's pitch black outside, and someone you didn't like very much just happens to disappear after telling a drunk story about seeing a glowing rider with black hounds. Oh no, the Harlequin got him. Case closed, no investigation, no CSI, Canterbury. Some historians believe the Wild Hunt myth may have been inspired by roving bands of mercenaries or cultish vigilantes who used the tale as a form of psychological warfare. Kill someone, blame the hunt, ride off into the fog. It's murder meets marketing. The kicker? The myth persisted. Even centuries later, locals reported hearing hoofbeats and howling, always followed by, well, missing people. And if there's one thing the Middle Ages were good at, it's making folklore feel like a crime scene. So was Harlequin a ghost, a metaphor, or just the Middle Ages' most efficient scapegoat? Maybe all three. Either way, if you hear spectral barking after midnight, lock your doors. Or better yet, don't go wandering into forests with names like Dead Man's Hollow. Ah, Germany. Land of precision engineering, sausage variety, and, apparently, guys named Christman Gnippertainga, whose name sounds like someone leaned too hard on a medieval typewriter while sneezing. Christman Gnippertainga may not be as well known as Gilles de Rais or Elizabeth Bathory, but if body count is your measuring stick, he's the overachiever of medieval murderers. According to 16th century German pamphlets, the tabloids of their day, Gnippertainga murdered 964 people over the course of a 15-year killing spree. And to be honest, after 400 or so, you'd think he'd pick up a hobby. The story goes something like this. Christman set up shop in a cave in the woods, medieval serial killer starter pack. From this cosy murder den, he posed as a bandit, ambushing travellers, merchants, and presumably anyone who looked remotely stabbable. His methods? Robbery, strangulation, and general unpleasantness. Think Robin Hood if Robin kept everything and killed you afterward. He was reportedly helped by a female companion he kidnapped and brainwashed, or as medieval pamphlets put it, converted to his evil ways. This was possibly less Stockholm Syndrome and more help me or end up in the stew. But Christman didn't just kill. He kept souvenirs, gruesome ones. He stored body parts, hoarded money, and even, if we're to believe the pamphlets, baked the occasional victim into pies. That's right. Long before Sweeney Todd sang about meat-filled vengeance, Christman was apparently serving up his version of Forrester-table cuisine. Eventually, someone got wise. Authorities captured him in 1581, and the execution was, let's say, elaborate. First, they broke him on the wheel, a process that involves, well, breaking you on a literal wheel. Then they tore his flesh with red-hot pincers. Then they tore it again, for good measure. And again, because someone really hated closing ceremonies. Finally, they decapitated him. You know, just to be extra sure. Now skeptics argue that Christman may have been the creation of Protestant propaganda, a fictional monster meant to represent the dangers of godlessness, or possibly poor cave hygiene. But others believe his existence and crimes were all too real. Either way, Christman Gnippertainga remains a terrifying footnote in Europe's blood-soaked history, a man with a kill count higher than most plagues, and a name longer than most grocery receipts. Welcome to Kilkenny Island, early 14th century, where Lady Alice Keitler had more ex-husbands than most people had decent meals. 4 of them, to be exact. And like any good medieval soap opera, they all ended up mysteriously ill, bankrupt, or extremely dead. Born into a wealthy Flemish merchant family, Alice was the kind of woman who collected money and husbands with equal enthusiasm. By the time her 4th spouse was found wasting away in 1324, possibly the medieval equivalent of ghosting via grave, people started to wonder whether Alice had a more hands-on approach to marital conflict resolution. Now, being a strong, independent woman in medieval Ireland was already suspicious enough. But Alice also had property, money, influence, and a maid named Petronilla, who didn't know how to keep a secret under torture. That's when Bishop Richard de Ladrade entered the chat. The good bishop had the energy of a man who had read one book on witchcraft and decided it was time to start a crusade. He accused Alice of heresy, sorcery, demon worship, love potions, and, most entertainingly, communicating with a demon named Robin Artisan, who, by the way, supposedly visited her in the form of a black, shaggy dog. That's right. Ireland's first demon-possessed serial killer may have also been a crazy dog lady. But here's the twist. Alice escaped. Possibly bribed some guards, possibly rode off into the mist on the back of Robin Artisan himself. Either way, she was gone. Vanished. Poof. Meanwhile, poor Petronilla, her maid, was left holding the cauldron and was burned at the stake for witchcraft, making her the first person in Ireland officially executed for heresy. To this day, Alice Keitler's guilt remains a hot debate. Was she a clever killer, hiding behind wealth and status, or the victim of misogyny, paranoia, and one bishop's very weird fan fiction? Either way, she made history, as the first woman in Ireland accused of witchcraft, possibly the most infamous poisoner in the country's medieval history, and a sharp reminder that if your maid starts talking during an inquisition, it's already too late. Rome, city of popes, poets, and one teenage girl who turned parricide into something halfway sympathetic. Beatrice Cenci was born in 1577 to a noble Roman family that had a lot of money, a lot of power, and absolutely zero chill. Her father, Francesco Cenci, was by all accounts a grade A monster, rich, arrogant, and the kind of man who believed discipline included locking his family in castles, and allegedly far worse things that polite scripts like this only hint at. Francesco's rap sheet included violence, exploitation, and a general talent for making everyone around him fantasize about his funeral. Rome knew. The authorities knew. The Pope even knew. But because Francesco was rich and well-connected, nothing ever stuck. It's the classic Renaissance legal strategy. If the bribes fit, you must acquit. So what's a traumatized daughter to do? Well, murder. In 1598, Beatrice, her stepmother Lucrezia, and her brother Giacomo decided enough was enough. They allegedly drugged Francesco, bashed his head in with a hammer, and, just to be sure, threw him off a balcony. Because nothing says natural causes, like blunt force trauma and a fall. Of course, this wasn't CSI, Vatican. The body was found. Questions were asked, torture was applied, and soon enough, Beatrice and her family confessed. Some say the torture loosened their tongues. Others say it just confirmed what everyone in Rome had been whispering for years, that Francesco Cenci had it coming. Now here's the part that turns tragic. Public opinion loved Beatrice. The people saw her not as a killer, but as a martyr, a young woman who had done what the courts never could. Petitions poured in. Crowds begged the Pope for mercy. The Pope said no. On September 11th, 1599, Beatrice was beheaded in front of a massive crowd. The executioner reportedly held up her head, and the crowd wept, because for once the killer wasn't the villain. She was the symbol of a system that protected monsters and punished their victims. If you've ever watched Game of Thrones and thought, wow, that poison plot was clever, just know the Italian women of the Renaissance were already light years ahead. These weren't just housewives with a grudge. They were professionals, artisans, chemists, entrepreneurs of death. They were the poisoners of Italy. Let's rewind to Renaissance Rome and Naples, places teeming with corrupt clergy, lusty nobility, and arranged marriages where "till death do us part" was often taken as a suggestion. Here, in the shadows of palaces and convents, a quiet trade emerged. The manufacturing and discreet distribution of aqua tofana, a colourless, tasteless, and beautifully lethal liquid. Just a few drops in your husband's soup and voila, he's off to meet the saints. Leading this movement was a woman named Giulia Tofana, often credited, or blamed, with perfecting this little murder elixir. Sold under the guise of cosmetic products, because of course it was, aqua tofana came in vials labelled as facial lotion, or holy water of St. Nicholas. Subtle, no? But here's the real kicker. This wasn't just a one-woman operation. No, Julia had help. Lots of it. Female apothecaries, widows, midwives, and even nuns allegedly became part of a shadowy network that served dissatisfied wives looking to edit their marital contracts permanently. It wasn't so much a guild as it was a sorority for strategic life reorganization. If you're wondering why authorities didn't shut this down sooner, well, it's hard to prove murder when the cause of death looks exactly like natural wasting. And with so many high-ranking clients, the local courts were often more interested in staying alive than dispensing justice. Eventually, though, whispers turned into confessions. Julia was arrested and, after some enthusiastic questioning, allegedly admitted to helping poison over 600 men. Others placed the number far lower, suggesting legend inflated the scale. Either way, the fallout was massive. Executions followed. The streets of Rome were briefly cleaner. And Aquitaine banned. Well, publicly at least. So next time you hear about medieval guilds, don't just think blacksmiths or tailors. Think of a quiet back room, a whispered name, and a tiny glass vial of destiny. You know the type. Stern face, iron will, possibly allergic to smiling. Every medieval town had one. That one church official who insisted their harshness was simply discipline. But sometimes discipline looks suspiciously like serial murder. And that's where Bishop Hatto of Mainz steps in. Or rather slinks in, with a crozier in one hand, and what we can only assume was a poison checklist in the other. Let's start with the basics. Hatto was a 10th century bishop who ruled over the region of Mainz in what's now Germany. A man of the cloth, yes, but that cloth may have been bloodstained. Allegedly. Depending on whom you ask, Hatto was either a hard-working administrator or the kind of clergyman who skipped straight to the fire and brimstone part of the Bible. He's best remembered for an infamous tale that sounds suspiciously like medieval propaganda, but honestly, it's too horrifying not to include. During a brutal famine, the peasants of Hatto's region came begging for food. Bishop Hatto, ever the humble servant of the Lord, welcomed them into a barn, and then locked the doors, and then set the barn on fire. Legend has it, he declared, "These are no men, they are rats," as the flames took hold. You know, normal bishop stuff. But karma in medieval legend comes with teeth. According to folklore, a swarm of actual rats descended upon Hatto, chased him to his tower on the Rhine, and ate him alive. Hence the tower's local name, the Mäuseturm, or Mouse Tower. Is this historically accurate? Probably not. But does it feel morally satisfying? Absolutely. Now, skeptics will argue that this tale is metaphor, a medieval fable about greed and justice, with rats as divine retribution. And sure, maybe Hatto didn't torch anyone. Maybe the barn fire story was a smear campaign cooked up by angry monks with excellent storytelling skills. But here's the thing, no one tells cautionary tales about nice bishops. The story stuck because, at some level, Hatto inspired fear. The kind that makes people whisper your name centuries later while shivering into their soup. Was he a serial killer? That depends on whether you count mass incineration during famine as murder or just very aggressive spiritual cleansing. Either way, Bishop Hatto definitely wasn't just strict. Ah, the nunnery, a peaceful haven of quiet prayer, modesty, and brutal murder. Enter Sister Benedetta Carlini, a 17th century Italian nun whose life reads like the first draft of a psychological thriller written by someone high on incense and unresolved trauma. While technically post-medieval, her story is just too juicy and too unhinged to leave out. Benedetta was an abbess in the Theatine convent of Pescia, Tuscany. She was famous for her visions, which included regular conversations with Jesus, spontaneous stigmata, and some divinely inspired bed-shaking. At first, her fellow nuns were impressed. After all, medieval and early modern Italy loved a good mystic. But the situation quickly escalated from holy woman to what in the mother of God is happening in this convent? As Benedetta rose in the convent ranks, so did the weirdness. She began experiencing violent fits and claiming to be possessed by Jesus himself, who apparently had a habit of borrowing her body like a weekend Airbnb. According to Benedetta, Jesus wanted a lot of alone time and was deeply invested in confession, especially private, one-on-one confession. And this brings us to her roommate, Sister Bartolomea. Bartolomea later confessed that Benedetta had been using these possessions as cover for, let's say, deeply non-canonical activities. According to testimony, Benedetta would claim to be channeling divine forces and then insist that Bartolomea submit to spiritual correction, multiple times, with passion and with very little scripture involved. But what makes Benedetta truly unsettling, beyond the forbidden trysts and religious cosplay, was her alleged manipulation and cruelty. Witnesses claimed she psychologically dominated other nuns, doled out harsh punishments, and even used her divine visions to silence dissent. Several deaths occurred under mysterious circumstances in her convent, and while she was never formally charged with murder, let's just say it wasn't exactly a spiritually uplifting place. Eventually, the church caught wind of the scandal. A formal investigation was launched, and Benedetta was stripped of power and imprisoned within the convent for the rest of her life. The church, in classic damage control mode, buried her story, which was then rediscovered centuries later, to the horror and fascination of modern historians. So was Benedetta Carlini, a victim of religious hysteria, a misunderstood mystic, or just a really clever predator in a wimple. Either way, confession has never sounded quite so ominous. Some people paint, some collect coins, and some, if you're Cardinal Robert of Geneva, treat mass murder like it's a team sport. Let's set the bloody stage. It's 1377, and Cesena, a picturesque little town in northern Italy, made the mistake of mildly questioning papal authority. That's like telling a medieval pope his hat looks a bit much. Heresy, sedition, cue the overreaction. Enter Cardinal Robert of Geneva, who would later become Pope Clement VII. Not to be confused with the Clement who made wine, this one made body piles. The papal states were in chaos at the time, with Italian city-states doing what Italian city-states do best, switching sides like they're in a medieval reality show. Cesena had revolted, or maybe sneezed the wrong way, and the church decided to make an example out of them. And by example, we mean war crime. Cardinal Robert, accompanied by John Hawkwood, a charming English mercenary who never met a paycheck he didn't like, marched into Cesena with a bunch of French and Breton troops. The town had already surrendered under peaceful terms, thinking things were sorted. Classic mistake. Once inside, the army began a 3-day massacre. And not just of rebels. We're talking civilians, priests, old men, and anyone who couldn't outrun a guy with a sword and poor impulse control. Between 2,000 and 5,000 people were slaughtered. That's not a cleansing. That's a medieval purge with paperwork. Robert later defended himself by claiming the massacre was necessary to restore order. You know, in the same way using a flamethrower on a fly is technically pest control. So, was he a serial killer? Technically, no. He didn't stalk individual victims. He wasn't doing it for pleasure. But here's the twist. He did it more than once. Cesena wasn't an isolated case of oops, too much smiting. Robert had a pattern of solving problems with fire, blades, and mass panic. And he got promoted for it. He became an anti-pope, which is like a regular pope, but with more political drama and significantly worse Yelp reviews. Robert of Geneva earned the nickname the Butcher of Cesena, not by his enemies, but by the people chronicling the event. When your historical nickname sounds like it belongs on a deli sign but involves thousands of corpses, you've probably crossed a line. Moral of the story: never trust a cardinal with a sword and something to prove. Grave robbing in medieval Europe was, believe it or not, a booming cottage industry. While modern people might complain about student loans or housing prices, medieval peasants had slightly different side hustles, like looting fresh graves, selling teeth, and occasionally misplacing the definition of deceased. Welcome to the cheerful tale of the resurrection men, not to be confused with literal resurrection, which they were not qualified for. though they often gave it a go anyway. These weren't your standard post-burial grave robbers. No, this gang specialised in pre-burial withdrawals. Let's focus on one case from 14th century Bohemia, where a particular band of gravediggers/opportunists developed a habit of helping people pass on before they actually had. In other words, if someone looked a bit pale, a bit limp, or, heaven forbid, merely unconscious, the resurrection men might decide to help nature along with a shovel, or a rock, or, in one recorded case, just by burying them anyway. These were rough times. Death was practically a roommate. Plague, famine, inquisitions, wolves with too much free time, and amidst this chaos, the line between almost dead and actually dead got a little blurry. For grave robbers paid by the corpse, that line was especially negotiable. The profession attracted people with, shall we say, flexible ethics. One Bohemian ring was accused of suffocating plague victims before they were fully gone. Why? Because corpses are easier to transport than people who are still breathing and screaming about being kidnapped. They'd then sell the bodies to medical students, alchemists, or overly curious monks, or worse, use them to fake martyr relics and get rich selling holy femurs of St. Kevin. Never mind that St. Kevin never made it past Slovakia. The church was horrified, obviously, but also secretly intrigued, because corpse-based miracles were kind of their thing. Authorities eventually caught on when one dead man woke up mid-sale, which tends to kill the resale value and cause shouting. So, were they serial killers? Not in the traditional hunting in alleyways sense, but their tally of early departures suggests a professional interest in expedited expiration. And in medieval times, that's really all it took to join the club. In modern times, we have criminal profilers, DNA testing, CCTV, and that one neighbour who always knows too much about everyone's business. But in medieval times, if someone got murdered in the woods and no one was around to see it, well, it was basically just Tuesday. Let's talk about the ones we never caught. The silent monsters who roamed without names, motives, or even half-decent sketches. They left no journals, no manifestos, just a trail of conveniently missing villagers and the occasional cryptic stain in a barn. Case in point, the werewolf of Poligny. In 1521, France, yes, we're fudging the medieval cut-off by about 20 years, but trust me, nobody had updated their ethics software yet. Villagers were found ripped apart, not stabbed, not beaten, torn. Naturally, this led to the only logical explanation: werewolves. 3 men were eventually arrested and confessed, but if you've ever tried saying "I'm not a werewolf" while being mildly waterboarded with wine and guilt, you'll understand why confessions in medieval Europe aren't exactly reliable. Then there's the Crossroads Killer in Eastern Europe, a series of unsolved disappearances near merchant routes between Poland and Ruthenia. Bodies, when found, were often mutilated and dumped near crossroads, a traditional dumping ground for anything unholy, including old boots, pagan idols, and apparently serial killers' leftovers. The crimes were blamed on everything from highwaymen to witches to demonic woodcutters. The real killer? We'll never know. Let's not forget the monastery murders of Devon, circa 1304. 4 monks disappeared over a single winter. Locals blamed wolves. Wolves, for their part, issued a formal denial. A 5th monk survived and was found naked, muttering about the one in the red hood. No culprit, no trial, just lots of awkward silence and hastily rewritten abbey records. These phantom killers had several advantages. 1. They lived in an era where death was expected. 2. Witnesses could be bribed with a chicken and some fear of hell. And 3. No fingerprints, no forensics, and definitely no podcasts about their crimes. So when we talk about the most notorious medieval serial killers, spare a thought for the ones who never made it into the annals. Not because they weren't brutal, but because they were just that good at staying in the shadows. Eleanor was born in 1122 into a world that would soon feel her presence like a storm breaking over calm seas. She was the daughter of William X, Duke of Aquitaine, and Eleanor de Châtellerault, and from her earliest years She absorbed the culture and grandeur of one of Europe's richest duchies. Aquitaine was not some backwater county. It was a land of abundance, where vineyards spilled over rolling hills, troubadours sang of love and valour, and courts buzzed with poetry and music. Unlike the rigid and often dour northern kingdoms, the south of France lived with passion, style, and an almost Mediterranean flair. It was into this environment that Eleanor was raised, and it would shape her worldview for the rest of her long life. Tragedy struck early, however. In 1137, her father died suddenly while on pilgrimage, leaving the 15-year-old Eleanor not just an orphan, but also the undisputed Duchess of Aquitaine. With this inheritance, she instantly became the most sought-after prize in Europe. Her lands stretched from the Loire River down to the Pyrenees, a domain larger and wealthier than even the holdings of the French crown itself. Every ambitious nobleman dreamed of securing her hand, and with it, the authority over Aquitaine's people, trade, and castles. But Eleanor was not a passive prize to be claimed. Even as a teenager, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew she was born to rule. Chroniclers describe her as intelligent, charismatic, and strikingly beautiful, though her true power lay not in her looks, but in her keen mind and political instinct. She had been educated in literature, music, and governance, making her far more prepared to wield power than many men twice her age. It did not take long for the King of France, Louis VI, to recognise that such a duchess could not be left vulnerable to rival suitors. He swiftly arranged for Eleanor to marry his son and heir, the young Louis VII. Within months of her father's death, Eleanor was escorted north, surrounded by an armed guard to ensure her safety. The girl from the cultured courts of Aquitaine was about to enter a harsher, colder world, the throne of France. Eleanor of Aquitaine had begun her journey, not as a quiet bride, but as a ruler in her own right, and she was only just getting started. At just 15, Eleanor was thrust into a new role, Queen of France. Her marriage to Louis VII in 1137 was not the union of equals she might have imagined. It was a collision of two very different worlds. Louis, raised in a cloistered, pious environment, had once been destined for the church before the unexpected death of his older brother made him heir to the throne. He carried into marriage a monk's austerity, preferring prayer and ritual over laughter and feasting. Eleanor, by contrast, embodied the spirit of Aquitaine, vibrant, confident, and steeped in a culture that prized art, music, and poetry. Their union was less a meeting of hearts than a merger of political necessity. Paris, where Eleanor was now expected to rule beside her husband, felt bleak and cold compared to the warm, cultured south she had left behind. The French court was dominated by rigid traditions and suspicious courtiers, many of whom viewed Eleanor's independence as dangerous. They whispered about her boldness, her fashionable clothes, and her insistence on bringing troubadours and poets into the royal household. To the conservative elite, she was too outspoken, too flamboyant, too much. Yet Eleanor refused to shrink herself. She infused Paris with Aquitaine's love of refinement, commissioning music and literature, and setting the stage for what would later evolve into the ideals of courtly love. Still, her marriage with Louis quickly revealed its cracks. He was cautious, often indecisive, and more interested in spiritual matters than political manoeuvring. Eleanor, on the other hand, had been raised to govern and expected to be heard. Her sharp tongue and unflinching honesty frequently clashed with Louis's timidity. She mocked his hesitations, while he bristled at her ambition. Their differences, far from complementing one another, grew into sources of tension. Yet even in these early years, Eleanor showed the qualities that would make her one of Europe's most remarkable rulers. She advised her husband on matters of state, involved herself in diplomacy, and began to cultivate her own networks of influence. Though Louis was king, it was Eleanor's wealth and authority over Aquitaine that gave the crown much of its power. Without her, the French monarchy would have been far weaker. By the time the call for the Second Crusade sounded, Eleanor was not just Queen of France. She was a woman determined to prove that she was more than a decorative consort. She was ready to take her ambitions onto the world stage. In 1147, the the call went out across Christendom. The Second Crusade had begun. The fall of Edessa to Muslim forces shocked Europe, and Pope Eugenius III rallied the faithful to reclaim the Holy Land. Louis VII, eager to prove himself as a devout Christian king, quickly took up the cross. But what shocked contemporaries was Eleanor's decision. She too vowed to go east, not as a passive queen, but as a leader in her own right. Her choice was bold, even scandalous. Few women of her rank joined crusades, and even fewer did so with the determination to lead their own vassals. Eleanor summoned knights from Aquitaine, many loyal more to her than to her husband, and announced she would accompany them to the Holy Land. Chroniclers record the shock of the French nobility. Here was a queen not content to wait in Paris, but demanding a sword-bearing role in the most sacred war of the age. As the armies marched, Eleanor became a figure of fascination. She travelled at the head of her retinue, dressed in armour, commanding attention wherever she went. Troubadours would later romanticize her presence, claiming she embodied the very ideals of chivalry and courtly love. Yet her involvement also sowed discord. Louis, already insecure about his authority, found himself overshadowed by his wife's charisma and decisiveness. Soldiers whispered that they would rather follow Eleanor than their hesitant king. The crusade itself was a disaster. Poor planning, squabbling leaders, and treacherous terrain turned the French army's march through Anatolia into a nightmare of starvation and ambush. By the time they reached Antioch, morale was broken. It was here that Eleanor's influence reached its height, and her marriage began to unravel. Raymond of Poitiers, her uncle and the Prince of Antioch, welcomed her with open arms. Eleanor admired his energy and strategic vision, and she urged Louis to support him in a campaign against Aleppo. Louis refused, insisting on continuing to Jerusalem. Rumours exploded. Chroniclers suggested Eleanor and Raymond were too close, perhaps even lovers. Whether gossip or truth, the scandal spread like wildfire. Louis, humiliated, ordered Eleanor to leave Antioch with him by force. The crusade limped on, achieving nothing of note, but the damage was done. When the royal couple returned to France, their marriage was beyond repair. The crusade had shown the world two truths. Louis was an ineffectual king, and Eleanor of Aquitaine was a woman who would not be silenced. By the early 1150s, Eleanor's marriage to Louis VII was in tatters. The crusade had left scars too deep to ignore. Whispers of infidelity, political disagreements, and above all, the absence of a male heir. Though the couple had two daughters, Louis longed for a son to secure the Capetian dynasty. Eleanor, for her part, seemed increasingly frustrated by his timidity and his refusal to let her exert the influence she believed was her right. Their union, once forged as a political alliance, now stood as a constant reminder of incompatibility. In 1152, the inevitable came. At Beaugency, the marriage was formally annulled on the grounds of consanguinity. They were distant cousins, and the church, eager to end the scandal, accepted the excuse. Eleanor was free, her daughters remaining with Louis, and she once again controlled Aquitaine in her own name. Few women in medieval Europe had ever regained such independence. But Eleanor was not a woman to live long without a crown. Almost immediately, suitors began circling. Her lands made her the most eligible heiress in Europe, for the second time. Some tried to abduct her on her journey home, hoping to force marriage by kidnapping. But Eleanor was shrewd and swift. Within weeks of her annulment, she struck a daring alliance. She married Henry of Anjou, the fiery, ambitious duke nearly 12 years her junior. Their wedding was sudden, bypassing the need for French royal approval, and it shocked the courts of Europe. This was no ordinary match. Henry was not only the Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, he was also in line to inherit the English throne. Their union fused Aquitaine, Normandy and Anjou into a vast power block that rivalled and even threatened the French crown itself. When Henry became King of England in 1154, Eleanor was once again a queen, but this time not of a single kingdom. She was queen consort of an empire stretching from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. Her second marriage was not built on romance, but on raw power and ambition. Eleanor had moved from being the frustrated consort of a timid king to the partner of one of Europe's most dynamic rulers. But as she would soon learn, life with Henry would bring both triumph and turmoil. When Henry Plantagenet ascended the English throne in 1154 as Henry II, Eleanor once again found herself wearing a crown, this time in Westminster, not Paris. At 32, she was already a seasoned ruler, but now her influence stretched across an empire historians would later call the Angevin Empire, from the misty highlands of Scotland to the sun-soaked vineyards of Aquitaine. As queen consort, Eleanor was not content with ceremonial duties. She ruled actively, especially in her beloved Aquitaine, where her authority was unquestioned. Eleanor's greatest legacy during these years, however, was her role as mother. Between 1153 and 1167, she bore Henry 10 children. 5 sons and 3 daughters survived to adulthood, ensuring the continuation of the dynasty. Her sons were no ordinary princes. They would become some of the most famous names in medieval Europe: Henry the Young King, Richard the Lionheart, Geoffrey of Brittany, and John, the future Lackland. Each inherited not only their father's ambition, but also their mother's fiery spirit, and Eleanor took a deep interest in their upbringing. She encouraged them to see themselves not just as rulers, but as heirs to a culture of refinement. In her courts, she invited troubadours, poets, and scholars, exposing her children to the ideals of chivalry and courtly love. While Henry focused on law, administration, and expanding his dominion, Eleanor created a cultural identity for the dynasty that set it apart from the dour traditions of northern monarchies. But her marriage to Henry was far from blissful. Though united by ambition, the two were equally strong-willed, and sparks often flew. Henry was notoriously unfaithful, fathering children with mistresses, and Eleanor's pride bristled at the humiliation. The couple spent increasing time apart, Eleanor often ruling Aquitaine independently while Henry managed affairs in England and Normandy. Still, their political partnership remained formidable, their combined lands dwarfing the holdings of the French crown. As her sons grew, Eleanor poured her energy into preparing them for rule. But in doing so, she also planted the seeds of rebellion. Her loyalty was never blind. She believed her children should have power of their own, not remain under Henry's iron grip. And when her sons turned against their father, Eleanor would make a decision that shocked Christendom. She would side with them, even against her king. The queen who had once marched on crusade was about to march into family rebellion. By the 1170s, Eleanor's marriage to Henry II had soured beyond repair. Once bound by shared ambition, the couple had grown into bitter rivals. Henry's relentless expansion of royal authority and his endless string of mistresses had humiliated Eleanor. Worse still, he refused to grant their grown sons real power, keeping them dependent while he ruled like an emperor. For Eleanor, this was not just a personal insult. It was a dangerous political miscalculation. Their sons, restless and ambitious, were ready to rebel, and Eleanor was prepared to help them. In 1173, the storm broke. Henry the Young King, frustrated at being crowned co-king without any true authority, allied with his brothers Richard and Geoffrey to rise against their father. Eleanor, ruling Aquitaine with increasing independence, encouraged their cause. Chroniclers suggest she secretly coordinated with her sons and even sought support from Henry's greatest enemy, King Louis VII of France, her former husband. It was a bold move, one that risked everything. But Henry was no easy foe. He crushed the rebellion with ruthless efficiency, defeating his son's forces in Normandy and England. Eleanor's involvement did not remain hidden for long. In 1174, while travelling to join her rebellious children, she was captured by Henry's men. Betrayed and powerless, she was brought before the king, who could not tolerate such defiance from his own queen. Henry's punishment was harsh. Eleanor was imprisoned, first in England, and later moved between various castles. For the next 16 years, she lived under house arrest, her once vast influence reduced to whispers through the walls of her confinement. She was allowed little contact with the outside world, cut off even from her beloved Aquitaine. Yet even in captivity, Eleanor's legend grew. Troubadours continued to sing of her beauty and wit, and stories of her defiance spread through Europe. Her sons, though defeated, still saw her as the guiding force of their ambitions. She became a symbol of resistance against Henry's suffocating rule, a queen who refused to bow quietly. Eleanor endured her imprisonment with patience and calculation, waiting for the moment when the tides of fortune would turn. That moment came in 1189, when Henry's death finally released her chains and restored her to the centre of power. The imprisoned queen was about to rise again, this time as the matriarch of kings. In July 1189, Henry II died at Chinon, broken and embittered, betrayed by the very sons he had tried to control. When news reached Eleanor, still under guard, the tide of her fortune shifted in an instant. After 16 years of confinement, she was released, not as a widow cast aside, but as the indispensable mother of the new king, Richard the Lionheart. At 67, Eleanor stepped back into the political stage with the authority of experience and the aura of survival. Richard adored his mother. Unlike Henry, who had sought to stifle her influence, Richard recognized her value. He entrusted her with responsibilities that went beyond ceremony. While he prepared for the Third Crusade, Eleanor became the regent of England, overseeing the realm's administration, finances, and diplomacy. For a woman in her late 60s, this was nothing short of extraordinary, yet Eleanor embraced the task with vigour. Her rule was pragmatic and effective. She travelled tirelessly across the kingdom, ensuring loyalty to Richard and quelling dissent. She organised the immense taxation needed to fund his crusade, smoothing over resentment with her charisma and authority. In an age where many barons might have seized the chance to weaken royal power, Eleanor's steady hand preserved the realm. She was no longer merely a duchess, queen, or consort. She was a matriarch governing in the name of her son. When Richard departed for the Holy Land in 1190, Eleanor's role became even more critical. She not only safeguarded his kingdom, but also navigated the delicate politics of succession. With Richard gone, whispers swirled about his younger brother John, ambitious, impatient, and eager to claim power. Eleanor worked tirelessly to suppress these ambitions, warning nobles against betrayal and securing Richard's position from afar. Even more impressively, Eleanor still wielded influence on the international stage. She corresponded with rulers, arranged alliances, and even negotiated marriages for her children and grandchildren. She was the glue that bound the sprawling Angevin dynasty together, her voice carrying weight across courts in France, England, and beyond. For Eleanor, this was vindication. Once silenced and imprisoned, she now stood at the centre of European politics once more. But her greatest test as Queen Mother was still to come. Richard's capture on his return from Crusade, and the ransom that would nearly bankrupt kingdoms. And it would be Eleanor herself who rode at the heart of that crisis. The year 1192 brought disaster. As Richard the Lionheart returned from the Third Crusade, he was captured near Vienna by Leopold of Austria, a former ally turned bitter enemy. Soon after, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI claimed custody, demanding a ransom so colossal it stunned Christendom. 150,000 marks, roughly 2 to 3 times England's annual income. For most kingdoms, it would have been impossible, but Richard had one advantage no other monarch could boast: his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. At 70 years old, Eleanor should have been enjoying a quiet widowhood. Instead, she became the driving force behind the effort to free her son. She toured England tirelessly, raising the ransom through special taxes, confiscations of church treasures, and loans from merchants. Chroniclers describe her travelling from town to town, appealing to clergy and nobles alike, her presence both commanding and persuasive. Her determination galvanised the kingdom. People gave not just out of duty, but because Eleanor's authority left no room for hesitation. Yet even as she fought to save Richard, Eleanor faced another battle, her youngest son, John. True to form, John attempted to exploit his brother's imprisonment by scheming for the crown. He allied with Philip Augustus of France, Richard's longtime rival, and plotted to seize control of England. But Eleanor, ever the political strategist, countered him at every turn. She warned nobles against supporting John, fortified key castles, and made sure Richard's throne remained intact until his return. In 1194, after 2 years of relentless effort, Eleanor travelled personally to Germany to deliver the final ransom payment. Imagine the scene. An elderly queen, still regal and unbowed, presenting the gold and silver that represented the sacrifices of an entire kingdom. When Richard was finally freed, it was Eleanor who accompanied him back, her presence a symbol that even kings owed their crowns to her resolve. Richard's release was Eleanor's greatest triumph, but also her last great act for him. Within 5 years, he would die from a wound in battle, leaving the crown to John, the very son she had spent so much time restraining. Now, in her twilight years, Eleanor would face her final challenge, guiding a flawed king and ensuring the survival of the dynasty she had sacrificed so much to build. By the late 1190s, Eleanor of Aquitaine was well into her 70s, an age that few medieval women ever saw, let alone while still wielding power. The death of Richard the Lionheart in 1199 was a devastating blow. He had been her favoured son, the one who trusted her wisdom and respected her authority. His death left the crown in the hands of her youngest child, John, a man whose flaws were as legendary as his lineage. Eleanor, though weary, stepped once more into the fray to secure the throne for him. John's succession was contested. Arthur of Brittany, the son of Eleanor's deceased son Geoffrey, had a strong claim and the support of many in France. Eleanor, however, was determined to see John crowned. She travelled to Aquitaine, rallying her vassals and fortifying her duchy in his name. In her late 70s, she endured sieges, negotiated with nobles, and displayed the same resilience she had shown as a young duchess. Chroniclers marvelled at her stamina. This was no queen mother content to fade quietly into the background. In 1200, Eleanor played a final role on the international stage when she journeyed to Castile to escort her granddaughter Blanche north, arranging her marriage to the future Louis VIII of France. Even at nearly 80, she rode across the Pyrenees, managing delicate diplomacy with the skill of a veteran stateswoman. Her efforts not only strengthened dynastic ties, but also cemented her role as a linchpin of European politics. As her health declined, Eleanor withdrew to the Abbey of Fontevraud, a place of peace after a lifetime of turbulence. Yet even here, she was no passive figure. She remained a revered matriarch, her counsel sought by kings and nobles alike. She outlived most of her contemporaries, a living legend whose life spanned from the world of the early Crusades to the dawn of the 13th century. Eleanor died in 1204 at the age of 82, a remarkable span in an age when life was often short and brutal. She was laid to rest at Fontevraud beside Henry II and Richard the Lionheart, husband and son, rivals and allies. Her tomb effigy shows her not with folded hands in prayer, but holding an open book, as if still reading, still learning, still ruling. Her legacy was immense, a duchess, 2-time queen, mother of kings, patron of culture, and one of the most formidable women in medieval history. Eleanor of Aquitaine had lived not just one life, but many, and in each she had left an indelible mark on Europe. Long before swords were unsheathed or ships set sail, the Crusades began with something far quieter and more intimate: a vow. For knights and peasants alike, the road to Jerusalem started not on the battlefield, but at the altar. In the dim light of medieval churches, men and women stood before priests, confessing their sins and swearing to take the long, dangerous road east. This was no casual promise. It was a binding oath, spoken aloud and sealed with the sign of the cross. When someone took the cross, it wasn't just a metaphor. The priest would bless strips of cloth, shaped into small red crosses, and sew them onto the pilgrim's cloak or tunic. That symbol instantly transformed the wearer. A farmer was no longer just a farmer. A knight was no longer just a knight. They were now crucessignati, marked by the cross, publicly and permanently committed to the journey. From that moment, their lives were no longer their own. They belonged to God's cause. This vow carried profound weight. It was believed that the pilgrimage itself, regardless of survival, could cleanse the soul. To walk to the land where Christ had lived, died, and risen was considered the highest form of devotion. And the risks were enormous. Pilgrims knew they might never return. Bandits, disease, starvation, and war made the road to Jerusalem one of the most perilous undertakings of the Middle Ages. Yet still, people flocked to swear the vow. For knights, the commitment was doubly heavy. They were not only promising to walk the pilgrim's road, but also to defend it with their swords. The crusade was framed as both journey and war, a march of penance that would end, if God willed it, with the liberation of the Holy Sepulchre. For commoners, the vow often meant abandoning farms, families, and entire livelihoods. To take the cross was to embrace uncertainty, trusting that heaven itself was watching. This act of devotion was deeply public. Families wept as fathers, sons, and daughters donned the cross, knowing the journey might claim their lives. But there was pride too. In towns across Europe, pilgrims became walking symbols of faith, marked by the simple red cloth that told the world they were bound for Jerusalem. The Crusades, then, began not in blood, but in faith, each campaign fueled first by the whispered words of a vow and the quiet courage it demanded. Once the vow was taken, the pilgrim's journey was sanctified with blessings and promises. The Church understood that no one would leave hearth and home, risk life and fortune, without powerful spiritual incentives. And so, indulgences became the heartbeat of Crusader culture. Popes, bishops, and priests proclaimed that those who marched east were not merely travellers, but soldiers of Christ. To them was offered what no earthly treasure could rival: remission of sins. For many medieval Christians, burdened by the constant fear of damnation, this was salvation wrapped in parchment and seal. Urban II's fiery call in 1095 at Clermont had made it clear: whoever goes to Jerusalem, if only out of devotion, shall have immediate remission of sins. These words echoed across Europe, binding spiritual reward to physical journey. The blessings came in layers. Before departing, Crusaders received Mass and holy rites, often kneeling barefoot before bishops as prayers were said for their safe travel. Some carried with them relics, small fragments of saints' bones, bits of cloth, or even soil from holy sites, believed to grant divine protection. Priests sprinkled pilgrims with holy water and gave them tokens of faith, assuring them that every mile walked was counted in heaven's ledger. But indulgences were more than abstract promises. They shaped the psychology of the Crusaders. For the poor peasant, it meant escape from the weight of everyday sin. For the knight, often stained with the blood of battles and feuds, it offered a chance at redemption. The Church preached that fighting in the East could cleanse the guilt of killing, because this time the sword was raised in God's service. To die on the road to Jerusalem was not failure, but martyrdom, a ticket to paradise. These spiritual rewards gave the crusade its unique identity. Unlike a simple pilgrimage, where one sought personal salvation, the crusade combined penance with military duty. Each prayer before departure, each blessing, and each indulgence transformed the dangerous journey into a sacred mission. Even the hardships ahead, hunger, thirst, wounds, were reframed as part of the pilgrim's penance. In the eyes of those who swore the vow, the road was not paved with despair, but with hope. Every blister, every drop of sweat, every heartbeat under the burning sun was a step toward cleansing the soul. In Crusader culture, blessings and indulgences weren't just comforts. They were the very fuel that kept men and women marching toward the distant, shimmering promise of Jerusalem. Once the vow was sworn and indulgences secured, the reality of pilgrimage began, the road itself. Reaching the Holy Land was no short stroll. It was a trek across continents, rivers, mountains, and deserts. Pilgrims and Crusaders had two main choices, by land or by sea. Each path carried its own perils. The overland route wound through the heart of Europe, across the Alps and down through Hungary, the Balkans, and Byzantine territory. It was a march that could take months, even a year. Entire villages seemed to uproot themselves as peasants, priests, and knights joined the throngs heading east. Chroniclers describe endless processions of wagons creaking along muddy tracks, women carrying children, and priests leading hymns to keep spirits high. Yet the road was also dangerous. Robbers preyed on the weak, supplies often ran short, and local lords sometimes resented the flood of strangers trampling through their lands. The sea route promised swifter passage. Pilgrims boarded ships in Italian ports like Venice, Genoa, or Bari, sailing toward Constantinople or directly to the Levant. But the Mediterranean was no gentle highway. Storms could sink entire fleets, while disease spread like wildfire in the cramped, filthy holds of medieval ships. Many who set sail never saw land again, their bones claimed by the sea. Travel was penance in itself. Food was scarce, often little more than hard bread and thin stew. Fresh water was a luxury. Disease, dysentery, fevers, plague stalked the camps where thousands gathered each night. Those who survived bore the marks of the road, blistered feet, gaunt faces, and scars from encounters with brigands or hostile locals. Yet the hardships were also bound with ritual. Pilgrims stopped at shrines along the way, praying before relics that promised protection. In Byzantium, they marvelled at Hagia Sophia's domes, feeling they had stepped into heaven's vestibule. Each stop reminded them that their suffering had meaning, that every mile brought them closer to Jerusalem. The road became a theatre of contrasts, faith and fear, devotion and despair. Some dropped out, returning home in shame. Others pressed on, driven by the belief that the journey itself was a holy act, worth every drop of sweat and blood. For in Crusader culture the destination was glorious, but the road, the grueling, punishing, sanctified road, was itself part of salvation. For those who survived the long, punishing journey, the sight of Jerusalem was overwhelming. Pilgrims who had trudged across Europe or braved the storms of the Mediterranean often wept when they first glimpsed the city's walls. Chroniclers describe men and women falling to their knees, kissing the ground, and praising God with tears streaming down their faces. To them, this was no ordinary destination. It was the earthly heart of heaven. The rituals of arrival were deeply symbolic. Pilgrims entered the city barefoot, a gesture of humility, and often circled its walls in silent reverence. Many went directly to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site where Christ was believed to have been crucified, buried, and resurrected. To kneel before the tomb was the ultimate goal of their pilgrimage. They touched the stone of the anointing, lit candles, and sometimes pressed small relics against the sacred rock, believing it absorbed holiness. For knights who had come with sword in hand, this moment carried the weight of justification. All the battles and bloodshed were sanctified by reaching this shrine, but Jerusalem was not the only holy site. Pilgrims climbed the Mount of Olives, where Christ had ascended, and walked the Via Dolorosa, retracing his steps to Calvary. They prayed in Bethlehem at the Church of the Nativity, and some ventured to Galilee to see the sea where Christ had walked upon the waters. Each site was a layer in the spiritual map of salvation, a living text of the Bible laid out in stone and earth. For commoners, these visits were acts of awe and devotion. For knights and nobles, they also reinforced the Crusade's central idea. This was holy war fused with holy pilgrimage. The relics they touched, the blessings they received, and the indulgences granted upon completing the journey all tied their spiritual fate to the land itself. The arrival was often capped with confession and communion, sealing the pilgrim's spiritual achievement. Some shaved their heads or donned simple garments as a sign of rebirth. Others brought back tokens, oil from lamps at the sepulchre, or small crosses made from local wood, as proof of their accomplishment. To step into Jerusalem was to step into the centre of the medieval imagination. For a Crusader pilgrim, reaching the Holy Land was not the end of the journey, but the crowning act of faith, where the physical world and the divine seemed to meet. For Crusader pilgrims, the Holy Land was not only a place of prayer, but also a treasury of sacred objects. Few returned home empty-handed. To touch, carry, or even own a fragment from Jerusalem was to bring back proof of devotion, a piece of sanctity that could transform one's household, chapel, or village. The most coveted treasures were relics. Some were grand, claimed splinters of the true cross, drops of Christ's blood preserved in crystal vials, or shavings of saints' bones encased in golden reliquaries. These were objects that bishops and princes sought, not only for their spiritual value, but for the prestige they brought. To house such a relic elevated a church into a pilgrimage centre of its own, drawing visitors, offerings, and power. But relics weren't reserved only for kings and bishops. Common pilgrims collected humbler tokens, small crosses carved from olive wood, bottles of oil from lamps burning in the church of the Holy Sepulchre, or flasks filled with water from the Jordan River. These ampullae, stamped with holy symbols, were worn around the neck or displayed at home as visible proof of the journey. Some were even believed to offer healing, as if the holiness of the land itself had seeped into the object. Knights, too, returned with relics, often carrying them into future battles. A piece of cloth touched to the sepulchre might be stitched into a banner. A carved cross might be fastened to a sword's hilt. These relics were not only signs of faith, but talismans of divine protection in warfare. For Crusader culture, relics blurred the line between spiritual devotion and martial duty. The trade in these objects was brisk. Local craftsmen in Jerusalem and Bethlehem catered to the demand, producing carved souvenirs and holy tokens for waves of pilgrims. Some accused unscrupulous sellers of passing off common trinkets as sacred treasures. But for many buyers, authenticity mattered less than the personal memory the item carried. When pilgrims returned home, their relics and souvenirs became part of their identity. Displayed in parish churches, they inspired awe among neighbours who had never left their village. Stories of the journey were retold beside the relics, binding communities to the larger narrative of Christendom. In Crusader culture, the relic was more than a keepsake. It was living proof, a fragment of the Holy Land that whispered of sacrifice, endurance, and the sacred journey completed. To medieval Christians, pilgrimage was not meant to be easy. Hardship was the very point. The Crusades, framed as armed pilgrimages, embraced this idea fully. Every blister, every wound, every hunger pang was seen as penance, a cleansing of the soul through pain. Knights and peasants alike believed that the physical trials of the road were spiritual currency, paying down the debts of sin. Fasting was a common practice, sometimes forced by necessity, other times chosen deliberately. Food often dwindled to scraps of hard bread or thin broth, and pilgrims interpreted their empty stomachs as holy discipline. Hunger became prayer, endured with the hope that each pang brought them closer to salvation. Even thirst in the desert was reframed as a holy trial, mirroring Christ's own suffering in the wilderness. Travel itself was designed to test humility. Many pilgrims walked barefoot for long stretches, their feet bleeding on stony paths, seeing each cut as another offering to God. Some carried heavy crosses or chains, weighing down their bodies as a reminder of Christ's burden. Illness and wounds, instead of being curses, were often understood as gifts, pain transformed into proof of devotion. Knights, who were used to wealth, horses, and comforts of rank, found themselves forced into the same hardships as commoners. This levelling effect reinforced the idea that all pilgrims, noble or peasant, stood equal before God. Marching together under the blazing sun, sleeping on hard ground, or battling swarms of flies blurred social lines. The suffering itself united them. The rituals of penance extended even into battle. Crusaders were told that wounds received in combat were not only honourable, but redemptive. To shed blood in the service of Christ's cause was a fast track to heavenly reward. The same sword that had once caused sinful violence could, in the Holy Land, become an instrument of salvation. At holy sites, Pilgrims often sought to intensify their penance. Some scourged themselves, whipping their backs until blood ran. Others lay prostrate for hours on the stones of the Holy Sepulchre, weeping openly. These acts were not viewed as extremes, but as powerful demonstrations of faith. In Crusader culture, suffering was not failure, it was the proof of sincerity. The harder the road, the greater the redemption. The very act of enduring pain turned the pilgrimage into a living prayer, one step closer to the eternal promise of forgiveness. Pilgrimage was never a solitary act. Though individuals took the vow, the journey itself was profoundly communal. To survive the long march to Jerusalem, Crusader pilgrims leaned on one another, forging bonds that blurred the lines of class, wealth, and status. In this shared trial, a knight, a priest, and a peasant might walk side by side, united by the cross stitched on their cloaks. Brotherhood began at home, when groups from the same town or region set out together. Known as confraternities, these bands of pilgrims pooled resources, shared food, and protected one another along the way. They sang hymns in unison, prayed as a body, and comforted each other through illness and death. In a world where travel was perilous, fellowship was both practical and spiritual. Each pilgrim saw the others not just as companions, but as fellow soldiers of Christ. Knights often took this communal spirit further, pledging to defend the weaker members of the group. Chronicles describe armed crusaders guarding caravans of peasants, treating the safeguarding of unarmed pilgrims as part of their holy duty. At night, nobles and commoners alike camped together, eating from the same pots and sharing stories around the fire. The hardships of the road stripped away some of the rigid hierarchies of medieval life, if only temporarily. This sense of unity extended into rituals of death. Pilgrims who died on the road were not left unmarked. Their companions buried them with prayers and makeshift crosses, believing that even if they never reached Jerusalem, their vow had been fulfilled in heaven's eyes. In this way, every member of the group carried the weight of the others, ensuring that no pilgrim's sacrifice was forgotten. The Brotherhood of the Cross also inspired the rise of formal military orders, like the Knights Templar and Hospitallers. These groups institutionalized the idea of defending pilgrims, creating permanent communities dedicated to both martial protection and spiritual service. They became symbols of the fusion between pilgrimage and warfare, embodying the communal ethos of the crusade on a grand scale. On the pilgrim road, loneliness gave way to solidarity. Every hymn sung, every burden carried, every grave dug deepened the sense that they were more than individuals. They were a body of Christ's faithful, journeying together toward redemption. The road to Jerusalem was brutal, but it was never walked alone. For those who survived the long journey to Jerusalem and back, the return home was more than just a homecoming. It was a transformation. Pilgrims did not come back as the same men and women who had left. They returned marked by experience, sanctified by hardship, and carrying stories and objects that set them apart from neighbours who had never travelled beyond the next village. The first sign of this transformation was visible, the cross on their garments. Many continued to wear the symbol after their return, proof that they had fulfilled their vow. To the community, it was a badge of honour. Parish priests welcomed them back with Thanksgiving masses, while neighbours gathered to hear tales of the distant Holy Land. These stories, of Byzantium's glittering domes, of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, of battles fought in desert heat, became part of the oral culture of medieval Europe, carried from hearth to hearth. Prestige followed naturally. A knight who had walked barefoot into Jerusalem could claim not only military honour, but also spiritual authority. His name carried weight in local courts. His words carried moral credibility. For commoners, the pilgrimage was an elevation in itself. A peasant who had stood at the sepulchre could never again be dismissed as ordinary. He had seen with his own eyes the centre of Christendom. Souvenirs and relics reinforced this aura. A flask filled with Jordan water, a splinter of olive wood from the Mount of Olives, or a cross touched to the sepulchre, became physical proof of the journey. Families displayed them in homes or parish churches, where they became objects of local devotion. In some places, these relics transformed small villages into new centres of pilgrimage, drawing visitors eager to touch a fragment of holiness brought from the East. The Crusader pilgrims' return also shaped political identity. Nobles boasted of their journey in charters, carving pilgrim crosses into their seals. Towns commemorated their warriors' vows in murals and churches, weaving the pilgrimage into civic pride. Even kings used it as propaganda, calling themselves defenders of the Holy Sepulchre to legitimize their reigns. For the individual pilgrim, however, the deepest change was inward. They had endured hunger, thirst, danger, and death. To return alive was to believe that God himself had guided their steps. Their lives became living testimony to the power of faith. The pilgrimage ended at home, but its impact lingered in every tale told, every relic displayed, every whispered prayer before a small piece of the Holy Land. By the time the last crusading armies faded from history, pilgrimage had already left its mark on medieval Europe. What began as personal journeys of penance had merged with the fury of holy war, creating a cultural hybrid unlike anything before. To be a crusader was to be both soldier and pilgrim, bound by oath, protected by indulgences, and defined by the belief that suffering and sacrifice opened the gates of heaven. The fusion of pilgrimage and warfare reshaped the medieval imagination. Knights who once fought for feudal lords now saw their battles as steps on a sacred road. Every campaign east was framed as a continuation of the pilgrim's vow. Even failure on the battlefield could be reframed as spiritual triumph, since simply setting foot on the journey was believed to cleanse the soul. Crusader sermons preached that Christ himself walked beside the armies, and each wound, hunger pang, or death along the way was part of God's plan. This ethos trickled into daily life back in Europe. Shrines and local pilgrimages flourished, modelled on the great journey to Jerusalem. Villagers who could never hope to cross the Mediterranean made smaller pilgrimages to regional holy sites, believing the same indulgences applied in miniature. The culture of walking, suffering, and praying as penance became a shared ritual across Christendom. The Crusades also institutionalized the protection of pilgrims. The military orders, Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, were born from this need. Their dual role as monks and warriors embodied the Crusader ideal, to pray like pilgrims and fight like soldiers. Even centuries later, their memory carried the aura of men who had given their lives to safeguard the Holy Road. Perhaps most importantly, pilgrimage left behind stories. Chroniclers filled Europe with tales of brave knights, humble peasants, and devout queens who endured the journey east. These accounts were read aloud in monasteries, retold in markets, and sung by troubadours. They gave meaning not only to individual sacrifice, but to the collective identity of medieval Christendom. By 1200, the Crusader pilgrimage was more than an event. It was a cultural template. It taught that devotion was not passive but active, that salvation required both prayer and pain. For Europe, the Holy Road to Jerusalem had become a mirror, reflecting its fears, hopes, and ambitions. And though the Crusader states would fall, the idea of pilgrimage as sacred struggle remained etched into the medieval soul, a legacy that outlived the wars themselves. By the late 12th century, the Crusader states carved out of the Holy Land after 1099 were fragile kingdoms perched precariously on foreign soil. Nearly a century had passed since the First Crusade had stormed Jerusalem, and in that time, Latin lords had grown accustomed to ruling in the East. But wealth and pride bred complacency. The kingdom of Jerusalem was divided by rival factions, its barons quarrelling even as threats mounted on the horizon. Their arrogance led them to underestimate the man who would soon bring their downfall, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, better known to the West as Saladin. Saladin was not just a warrior, but a statesman, uniting Egypt and Syria under his rule. His genius lay not merely in tactics, but in patience. While the Crusader barons bickered, he built an empire. Through diplomacy, marriages, and relentless campaigning, he transformed scattered Muslim territories into a cohesive power that could finally push back against the Crusaders. His vision was simple but profound. Jerusalem, sacred to Islam, must be reclaimed. The spark came in 1187 when Raynald of Châtillon, a notoriously reckless Crusader lord, broke the fragile truce by attacking a Muslim caravan. To Saladin, this was no minor offence. It was casus belli, a holy mandate for war. He called for jihad, rallying thousands to his banner, determined to bring an end to nearly a century of foreign occupation. The decisive moment arrived at the Horns of Hattin, a double-peaked hill near the Sea of Galilee. The Crusader king, Guy of Lusignan, marched his army into Saladin's trap. With supplies low and morale crumbling, they found themselves surrounded in the blistering July heat. Saladin's forces cut off their access to water, setting grass fires to choke them with smoke. The once proud knights of Jerusalem, armoured in steel, collapsed under the sun, their thirst unquenchable, their discipline broken. When the final clash came, the Crusaders were already beaten in spirit. Thousands were captured, including King Guy himself. The true cross, Christianity's most sacred relic, was seized by Saladin's men, a symbolic and psychological blow as devastating as the battlefield defeat itself. The victory at Hattin shattered the military backbone of the Crusader kingdom. With its armies destroyed, its leaders humiliated, and its holy relic lost, Jerusalem lay defenceless. Saladin's path to the holy city was clear, and the fate of the Crusader dream hung in the balance. The Battle of Hattin had broken the spine of the Crusader kingdom. With their army annihilated and their king in chains, the lords of Jerusalem could do little but watch as Saladin's forces advanced. In the summer of 1187, his banners swept across the countryside, taking castle after castle with terrifying speed. Towns that had once seemed secure now surrendered with barely a fight, their garrisons too shaken to resist. What had taken the Crusaders decades to build, Saladin dismantled in weeks. His campaign was methodical. He did not rush blindly for Jerusalem. Instead, he cut away its defences piece by piece. Acre, the bustling port that connected the kingdom to Europe, fell. Nablus, Jaffa, Caesarea, and Ascalon all crumbled before his advance. The strategy was clear: isolate Jerusalem, deny it reinforcements, and then move in for the final blow. For the Crusaders, the psychological impact was devastating. Reports of Saladin's victory at Hattin spread like wildfire, accompanied by stories of noble captives and the loss of the true cross. Pilgrims, merchants, and local villagers alike fled to Jerusalem, swelling its population and straining its resources. Within the walls, despair mingled with defiance. The city's new defenders were not the proud knights of Hattin. They were a patchwork of survivors, civilians, and desperate refugees. Yet, amid the panic, one figure emerged to lead Jerusalem's defence: Balian of Ibelin. Having been captured at Hattin but released on parole, he had sworn to Saladin he would not fight. But when he saw the city's helpless state, he broke his word, though he did so with Saladin's reluctant permission, granted on condition that he take up arms only to protect his family. Instead, Balian became the soul of Jerusalem's resistance, rallying a battered populace for what they knew might be their final stand. Meanwhile, Saladin marched steadily onward, his army buoyed by the momentum of victory and the promise of reclaiming Islam's holiest city. Chroniclers describe the confidence of his men as they encircled Jerusalem. The Crusaders had once entered the city with blood and fire, but now it would return to Muslim hands. By late September 1187, Saladin's banners appeared before Jerusalem's gates. The city that had been held by the Crusaders for nearly a century now faced its reckoning. The defenders braced themselves, but few doubted the outcome. The age of Crusader Jerusalem was about to end. When Saladin's army arrived before Jerusalem in late September 1187, the mood within the city was grim. For nearly a century, the Crusaders had called Jerusalem the heart of their kingdom, but now the kingdom of heaven was reduced to frightened refugees, scattered knights, and weary survivors from Hattin. The walls still stood tall, but behind them, morale was low, supplies thin, and the defenders vastly outnumbered. Saladin wasted no time. His forces encircled the city, cutting it off from escape or aid. Siege engines were brought forward, massive wooden towers, catapults, and mangonels, all aimed at battering down the walls that had once seemed impenetrable. To the defenders, the thud of stones and the creak of towers advancing were constant reminders that the end was near. Inside, Balian of Ibelin struggled to rally the citizens. Though only a handful of knights remained, he knighted every able-bodied boy of fighting age, arming them with whatever weapons could be found. Chroniclers describe women and children helping carry stones, boiling water, and even molten pitch to hurl down on attackers. It was not just an army holding the city, but an entire population preparing to die if necessary. The memory of 1099 hung heavily over both sides. When the Crusaders had stormed Jerusalem in the First Crusade, they had unleashed a massacre that shocked the Muslim world. Men, women and children slaughtered in streets and mosques. Many defenders now feared the same fate awaited them if the city fell. Some even urged desperate measures, threatening to burn down the Dome of the Rock and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, rather than see them captured. Saladin, however, showed a different spirit. He ordered his men to fight with discipline, forbidding indiscriminate slaughter. Still, he pressed the siege with relentless force. Siege towers rumbled forward, battering rams struck the gates, and Muslim troops fought tirelessly to breach the walls. After days of bombardment, the defences began to crumble. The Crusaders fought valiantly, but the imbalance was too great. By early October, Jerusalem was at breaking point. Balian recognised the truth. Continued resistance would mean not just defeat, but massacre. The city could not be saved by arms alone. If Jerusalem was to endure, its salvation would have to come not from swords, but from negotiation with Saladin himself. As Jerusalem's walls shuddered under constant bombardment, Balian of Ibelin knew the city's fall was only a matter of time. The defenders were exhausted, supplies dwindled, and morale was close to collapse. But surrender was not an easy choice. The memory of 1099, the Crusaders' own massacre of Jerusalem's inhabitants, haunted the city. Men and women alike feared that if the Muslims stormed the walls, every soul inside would be slaughtered in revenge. Balian, caught between despair and duty, chose diplomacy. He requested an audience with Saladin. Chroniclers record that the Sultan received him with calm dignity, listening as Balian argued for the lives of Jerusalem's people. The knight did not beg. Instead, he threatened that if no terms were offered, the defenders would burn the holy sites, slaughter Muslim prisoners, and force Saladin to capture nothing but ashes. It was a desperate gamble, meant to show that the defenders had nothing left to lose. Saladin, however, was unmoved by threats but swayed by principle. His reputation for honour was already renowned, and here he saw an opportunity to contrast himself with the brutality of the Crusaders 88 years earlier. Instead of demanding blood, he offered terms of surrender. The citizens of Jerusalem could ransom themselves, men for 10 dinars, women for 5, and children for 1. Those who paid would be allowed to leave in peace, carrying their possessions with them. For those too poor to pay, Saladin promised mercy, declaring that none would be killed. The terms stunned the defenders. Expecting annihilation, they were instead given a chance at survival. Balian accepted, and soon word spread throughout the city. Relief replaced terror, though fear lingered for those too poor to afford ransom. Moved by their plight, Balian and the city's clergy pleaded with Saladin, who responded with further generosity, freeing thousands of destitute Christians at his own expense. Even his commanders followed suit, purchasing captives' freedom with their own wealth. The contrast was unmistakable. Where the Crusaders had once drenched Jerusalem in blood, Saladin promised a more merciful conquest. The agreement did not erase the sorrow of defeat, but it spared the city from the nightmare of massacre. On October 2nd, 1187, the gates of Jerusalem opened, not to slaughter, but to a new chapter under Saladin's rule. On October 2nd, 1187, Jerusalem surrendered. The gates that had once been barred in desperation now opened to Saladin's army. Yet, unlike the storm of blood and fire that had marked the Crusader conquest in 1099, the handover was astonishingly calm. No massacre, no plunder, just an orderly transition of power orchestrated with deliberate restraint. Balian of Ibelin, who had defended the city to the end, walked beside Saladin's men to oversee the process. The defeated Crusaders and the civilian population gathered their belongings, preparing for exile. Families carried what little they could, bundles of clothes, cooking pots, cherished icons, while priests led processions, chanting hymns as they left behind the city they had called holy for nearly a century. The payment of ransoms became the practical business of surrender. Wealthier citizens handed over coins to secure safe passage, while the poor trembled at their inability to pay. True to his word, Saladin did not allow mass slaughter or indiscriminate slavery. He personally paid for the freedom of thousands, and his commanders followed his example. Even his own family contributed. Saladin's brother, Al-Adil, ransomed many of the poor from his private purse. The spectacle of mercy spread quickly, reshaping how Jerusalem's fall would be remembered. Saladin's entry into the city was staged with symbolic power. He rode through the streets not in triumphal arrogance, but in humility, dismounting to pray at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which had been used as a church under Crusader rule. The Dome of the Rock, stripped of its Christian altars, was cleansed and rededicated as a Muslim sanctuary. The city's most sacred sites were restored to their original place in Islamic devotion. The handover was not without pain. For Christians, it was an exile, a bitter end to the kingdom built with so much blood. Tears flowed as they left Jerusalem, their chants echoing through the streets one last time. Yet even in loss, they acknowledged that Saladin had kept his word. The city had not been drowned in blood as it had in 1099. This moment defined Saladin's legacy. Where others had chosen vengeance, he chose restraint. In an age when brutality was the norm, his mercy stood out as both a political calculation and a genuine act of faith. Jerusalem had changed hands, but it had been spared destruction. News of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe like a thunderclap. In October 1187, envoys, pilgrims and merchants carried the story westward. The holy city, held by the Crusaders for nearly a century, had been lost. For Christendom, it was more than a military defeat. It was a spiritual catastrophe. The very heart of Christian devotion, the site of Christ's passion and resurrection, was once again in Muslim hands. Pope Urban III is said to have collapsed in grief upon hearing the news, dying shortly afterward. His successor, Gregory VIII, wasted no time. In November 1187, he issued the papal bull Audita Tremendi, calling all of Christendom to arms. This was not just another campaign. It was proclaimed as the greatest crusade yet, demanding the participation of kings, nobles, and commoners alike. The loss of Jerusalem was framed as a punishment for sin, a divine chastisement that could only be answered with penance and holy war. Across Europe, pulpits thundered with sermons. Preachers painted vivid images of Christian pilgrims now barred from the Holy Sepulchre, of relics seized, of churches stripped of their altars. The true cross, captured at Hattin, became a symbol of humiliation. It was not only the city that had been lost, but also the spiritual prestige of Christendom itself. The call to arms spread with unprecedented urgency. Monarchs who had once hesitated to join crusading expeditions now felt the weight of obligation. Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire all took the cross, committing themselves to what would become the Third Crusade. This was the first time Europe's greatest rulers joined forces for a single crusading cause. But alongside outrage came a strange respect. Accounts of Saladin's mercy circulated in Europe, often with admiration. Chroniclers noted that he had spared lives, ransomed captives, and honoured his promises, behaviour that contrasted starkly with the bloody conquest of 1099. Some European writers even described him as a model of chivalry, a paradoxical foe both feared and admired. For ordinary Christians, however, nuance mattered little. The holy city was gone, and the road to salvation seemed blocked. Pilgrims mourned, priests wept, and villages across Europe rang with the cries of families sending fathers and sons to reclaim Jerusalem. The fall of 1187 was not just a military turning point. It was a cultural earthquake that shook the entire medieval world. And from its tremors, the greatest crusading effort in history was born. With Jerusalem secured in October 1187, Saladin's task was not finished. He had won the jewel of the Holy Land, but he knew that Europe would not let it go unchallenged. The fall of the city had been too great a shock. The armies of Christendom would surely march again. Saladin's genius lay not only in winning battles, but in preparing for what would come next, securing his victory so it would endure. His first priority was religious restoration. The Crusaders had turned Islamic holy places into Christian shrines, and Saladin reversed this process with deliberate care. The Dome of the Rock was cleansed and rededicated to Islam, its golden dome polished and adorned with Quranic inscriptions proclaiming God's greatness. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, used as a palace and church under Crusader rule, was purified and reopened for prayer. For Muslims across the region, the liberation of Jerusalem was not only political, but spiritual, a renewal of sacred space. At the same time, Saladin maintained a careful balance with the city's Christian population. Though many departed, others remained, and he ensured that churches such as the Holy Sepulchre were not destroyed. Pilgrimage would still be allowed, albeit under Muslim rule. This decision bolstered his reputation for mercy and helped avoid unnecessary unrest. Strategically, Saladin turned to fortifications. He strengthened the city's defences, rebuilt damaged walls, and garrisoned key strongholds throughout Palestine. Castles at Jaffa, Ascalon, and Acre, either newly captured or surrendered, were repaired to create a defensive buffer. He understood that holding Jerusalem required controlling the surrounding ports and fortresses, cutting off potential Crusader reinforcements from Europe. Politically, he worked to solidify alliances. The armies that had brought him victory were not just his own. They came from across the Muslim world, Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia. Saladin rewarded loyal emirs, secured the loyalty of his Kurdish and Turkish commanders, and reinforced the idea that this was not merely his triumph, but a victory for Islam as a whole. His authority, already immense, now carried the prestige of the man who had restored Jerusalem to Muslim rule. But even as he consolidated power, Saladin did not underestimate his enemies. He knew the kings of Europe were rallying. The Third Crusade was coming, led by Richard the Lionheart, Philip of France, and Frederick Barbarossa. Jerusalem's recapture was the height of his glory, but it also set the stage for his greatest challenge. By 1189, word of Jerusalem's fall had galvanized Europe, and the mightiest crusading force in history began to descend on the Levant. The Third Crusade was no ragtag army of minor lords. It was led by three of Europe's most powerful rulers, Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip II of France, and Richard the Lionheart of England. To Saladin, this was the storm he had long anticipated. Though Frederick's sudden death on the march crippled the German contingent, the forces of Philip and Richard eventually reached the Holy Land. Almost immediately, they made their presence felt. The first major test came at Acre, where Crusader remnants had laid siege to the city since 1189. When Richard arrived in 1191, he transformed the stalemate into a relentless assault. After months of grinding battle, Acre fell. For Saladin, it was the first bitter taste of reversal since Hattin. The stage was set for a titanic struggle between two men whose reputations would become legend, Saladin and Richard. Richard was everything his epithet suggested, a warrior king of immense courage, skilled in tactics, and utterly fearless in battle. Chroniclers describe him charging into the fray with a ferocity that inspired his men and unsettled his enemies. Saladin, by contrast, was the master strategist, cautious yet decisive, preferring attrition and maneuver over reckless charges. Their duel was not just of armies, but of wills and reputations. The clash at Arsuf in September 1191 epitomised this contest. Saladin's cavalry harassed the Crusaders as they marched along the coast, hoping to break their discipline. For hours, the Christians endured under a hail of arrows, until Richard unleashed a devastating countercharge that smashed Saladin's lines. Though not a decisive defeat, Arsuf restored Crusader confidence and cemented Richard's fame. Yet Saladin was no mere antagonist in Richard's story. Even his enemies acknowledged his nobility. During campaigns, he sent gifts of fruit and snow to the sick Lionheart, and when Richard's horse was killed in battle, Saladin sent him 2 replacements. Their rivalry was fierce, but it was tempered by mutual respect, each recognising in the other a worthy foe. The struggle continued in a series of indecisive campaigns along the coast. Richard recaptured Jaffa, but Jerusalem remained elusive. Saladin's careful defence and scorched earth tactics denied the Crusaders the supplies and momentum needed for a final push. The Lionheart's sword was mighty, but the city still lay in Muslim hands. By 1192, both sides were exhausted. Richard the Lionheart had reclaimed Acre, triumphed at Arsuf, and proven himself one of the most formidable warriors of his age. Yet despite his victories, Jerusalem eluded him. Twice he marched toward the holy city, and twice he turned back. The Crusaders lacked supplies, faced endless harassment from Saladin's forces, and feared that even if they captured Jerusalem, they could not hold it. For Richard, the dream of retaking the sepulchre remained tantalizingly out of reach. Saladin too was weary. Years of campaigning had drained his treasury and tested his armies. While his prestige soared after the capture of Jerusalem, holding the city against wave after wave of Crusaders came at immense cost. His empire stretched from Egypt to Syria, and he needed stability to secure it. Both commanders, recognizing the futility of endless war, moved toward negotiation. In September 1192, the Treaty of Jaffa was signed. Its terms reflected compromise. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, a triumph for Saladin, but Christian pilgrims were guaranteed safe passage to the city's holy sites. Coastal towns from Jaffa to Tyre stayed in Crusader hands, ensuring a foothold for the West. For both leaders, it was an imperfect peace, but it preserved their honour and spared their exhausted followers further bloodshed. Richard departed the Holy Land soon after, never setting foot in Jerusalem. Chroniclers say he approached the city but refused to enter as a pilgrim, unwilling to behold the sepulchre without reclaiming it. Saladin, meanwhile, returned to Damascus, his health failing after years of relentless strain. In 1193, only a few months after Richard sailed home, the great Sultan died. At his funeral, mourners discovered the measure of the man. Though he had ruled a vast empire and commanded immense wealth, Saladin's coffers were nearly empty. He had given away much of his fortune in charity, alms, and ransom for captives. He was buried with little more than a simple shroud, his legacy resting not in treasure, but in the memory of his deeds. For Muslims, he was the liberator of Jerusalem, the unifier of the faithful. For Christians, he was a formidable foe, yet also a figure of respect, remembered for his mercy and chivalry. In an age of brutality, Saladin stood apart, embodying both the sword and the spirit of leadership. His name endures as the man who reclaimed the holy city, and whose mercy became as legendary as his victories.